Since the 1950s, the frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves and heat wave season have been increasing around the world and in our city. In fact, the hottest day on record in Los Angeles County was on September 6, 2020, when temperatures soared to a blistering 121 degrees Fahrenheit in Woodland Hills, less than 20 miles northwest of UCLA's campus. Heat, no matter the time of year, is always top of mind for the researchers of the UCLA Heat Lab because the stakes couldn't be higher for us all. Welcome to Tell Us What You Know. I'm your host, Alvaro Castillo, with the UCLA College. Today, we're taking the temperature of the UCLA Heat Lab, and with me are Professor Bharat Venkat and some of his student researchers to learn more about their crucial work in a world that's only getting hotter. My first guest is Professor Bharat Venkat. He's a UCLA professor with joint appointments in the Institute for Society and Genetics, the Department of History, and the Department of Anthropology. He's also the director of the UCLA Heat Lab, which draws on a variety of academic disciplines, including architecture and urban planning, to biology, climate science, economics, geography, anthropology, and history. Professor Venkat, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The 2025 LA wildfires really turned the world's attention to the topic of heat. How have these fires affected the lab's work and the direction going forward?
So we know that the fires were caused by a multitude of factors, everything from how we build our cities, what kind of homes we build, where we build them, to who lives where, to climatic impacts on, for example, the amount of brush that's growing, the kind of brush, it's the availability of the rain, so on and so forth. But what the fires really kind of made clear to me is that while we have these moments of crisis and catastrophe, the underlying factors that lead to those moments are kind of longue durée, right? And so it's important that as researchers, we focus on these moments of crisis, but we also kind of understand that our work is to help understand all of those long existing factors that lead into those moments of crisis. And I think that's what we do in the lab is we take these really important issues around thermal inequality, around climate change and injustice, and we think about what are these kinds of deeper seated social, political, even biological issues that we need to address and really understand, which oftentimes takes time, right? It can't be done quickly. We can't respond to a crisis overnight. And that's why it's really important that we continue to do this work.
What can you tell us about the story of how conducting field work for your 2021 book, At the Limits of Cure, inspired you to study heat?
Yeah, my first book was about tuberculosis in India, which feels about as far away from extreme heat in Los Angeles as you can imagine, but actually it wasn't that far away. I was actually doing work in Delhi, and I had taken a train up to the kind of, let's call it the suburban area in Delhi, which is the capital city in India, to visit this hospital, one of the largest kind of tuberculosis hospitals in the country. And I get there, and there's no one there, right? And I'm a little surprised. This is a huge public hospital. There's normally lines around the block. So I'm walking around this hospital trying to figure out where everybody is, right? Where are the patients, where are the doctors, where are the nurses? I see a couple of dogs just lying around in the shade trying to kind of cool down. And I eventually stumble upon the on-call room, which is where doctors and nurses in hospitals take breaks, right? And the on-call room in this hospital was the only room that had an air conditioning unit. And all of the doctors and nurses were stuffed into this room. And they told me they had sent all of the patients home that day because it was too hot, right? And this is really kind of startling to me because, I was out there too, and I should have kind of realized this. But at that point, I was living in New York, and, whenever I go back to India, I think to myself, oh, it's hot, but I don't have a good gauge of what's too hot and what's too hot for people who actually live there, right? And it was kind of a revelation to understand that it was so hot that it was closing down a major public hospital. And it was leading to patients not getting vital treatment, right? So with tuberculosis, you're supposed to be getting regular treatment, multiple times a week. You're supposed to take your medications on time, and that's how you prevent the development of drug resistance. That's how you get cured, and that wasn't possible. And it really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that climate change is actually deeply damaging our health systems, and not just our health systems, really any sort of infrastructure you can imagine that's part of our modern world, right? Whether it be agriculture, even the ability to vote, right? To go and get into line to vote. And we've seen this the last couple of elections. Like, it can be incredibly hot. People might not want to wait out there. People might suffer from heat-related illnesses while waiting to cast their ballots, right? So down to our very elections, climate change is really this incredibly powerful factor that reshapes how we live today. And so that moment really kind of forced me to consider how I might take heat seriously, not just kind of as the background to my field work, but actually at the front.
Many students in the lab developed an interest in studying heat after taking your introductory Human Biology and Society course. Can you explain how you teach heat in this and other courses?
Climate change and heat specifically is the kind of problem that you have to approach in a multidisciplinary way, right? So heat impacts our cells, our organs, our entire bodies, but it also impacts our homes, our neighborhoods, our cities, our nation, right? And so to understand how heat works, you have to think across scale, but you also have to kind of use the tools of different disciplines. So that could be history or anthropology, it could be biology, it could be climate science. It's also architecture and urban planning. And so what I do in that course is that I expose students to how different disciplines think about heat at different scales and how those all connect up, right? So what heat does to our cells, what it does to our organs, is also tied to how our cities have been built to produce certain kinds of exposures, right? It's tied to how our homes are constructed, whether or not we have air conditioning. It's tied to public policy. It's tied to legislation. And so to really understand this problem of extreme heat and climate injustice more broadly, we have to learn to think in these ways that push us out of our silos, outside of our kind of disciplinary formations, outside of our majors, right? And really think about, how do I address this problem that requires me to bring everything I have to bear to it, right? And that's what the class does, is to kind of say to students, hey, this is something that you're all familiar with, right? So folks who are, most of my students are probably 18 to 22, right? They've been living under the specter of climate change their entire lives. This is not some foreign abstract thing. A lot of our students, here at UCLA come from neighborhoods and homes where they've experienced extreme heat. They've seen their parents come home after a hard day's work, suffering from maybe a heat-related illness, right? And so for them, this is not something that's just out there. It's something that's very, very proximate and close. So what I think this class does is it gives them a set of terms and tools for putting language and analysis to what they've already experienced. And I think that inspires a lot of students to say, hey, I want to do more. I want to learn more. I want to understand what this is all about. And that's why I've been fortunate to have a lot of students from that class join my lab.
Here to tell us more about her research and how it led to an LA Times op-ed and more is Sophia Sabra. She's a Human Biology and Society alumna who is now pursuing her master's in public health at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. She's also a co-author of the UCLA Heat Lab zine, Hot Wheels, at the intersection of labor and heat. Sophia, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sophia, you were one of the co-authors of an op-ed that was published by the LA Times titled, LA Loves Food Trucks. With more heat waves, they can be dangerous for people working in them. In addition to your pioneering research on food trucks being amplified by a major news outlet, it also led to policy changes. Can you share more about those experiences and what it meant to you as an undergraduate researcher?
The food truck research is really special to me because of the conversations we were able to have with food truck workers. They were nice enough to take the time out of their busy schedules to sit down with us and tell us about their experiences. Publishing an op-ed based on those conversations, in which I co-authored with my teammates, is one of my greatest accomplishments. I learned so much about the writing and publication process, and it felt amazing to represent food truck workers, highlight their work, advocate for better working conditions, and connect their stories to the larger problems of extreme heat. We also had the opportunity to meet with the team of a California Assembly member to address changes in policy that would promote health and cooling in food trucks. Often in policy and regulation, food trucks get grouped into restaurant codes, even though they are extremely different from restaurants. While that team ended up needing to focus their efforts elsewhere, it was still an amazing experience to see how policy and bill writing works at such a large level and really practice that skill. I felt really grateful to have these experiences as an undergraduate researcher. Experiences like these are what made me pursue public health as a profession and made me realize how my research, even a project that felt so local to UCLA at the time, can have such a meaningful impact overall.
When I was reading about the process of really looking at what this research would look like, how it would take place, how it would look to, engage in the research itself. I found it interesting that one of the things that you all had to do was really just go up to food truck workers and ask them if they wanted to participate. And it seemed like their willingness was through the roof. Can you talk more about what it was like to work with folks that did want to be part of this research?
Yeah, the recruitment really involved us just walking outside of our dorms and going up to these food truck workers and asking them if they would want to have a conversation with us. And that's why I valued these conversations, because they felt really natural and these encounters felt really organic. It was amazing to hear about work with these food truck workers, because a lot of the times they actually thanked us for taking the time to understand the conditions that they work in and to advocate for them. And I just find that really impactful. I think that we were able to have those conversations and be a voice for that.
Can you talk about what it was like to also package this research into a mini magazine? Like, what was that like? It's not the traditional mode of sharing research. How did it change the way that you delivered it or even approached the research?
Right. So we chose a zine to publish all of our findings because we wanted it to be accessible for so many different people and not something that, food truck workers so busy, right? And we wanted this project to really help them. So we didn't want to make this like a really long scientific article. So we chose a zine because we thought it could document all of our findings and our policy recommendations and just our suggestions overall in an accessible format. So we published it online and we also printed copies. And so we used both forms to get that out to individuals. The zine was a great way to express things because we were able to put up pictures of like our graphs from our temperature logging, or do bubbles of quotations that struck us from these conversations that we were having with workers. So it was a really interesting way, and it was very fun to create because it is so creative and different from the standard research outcome.
What's the biggest takeaway for our listeners when it comes to the Heat Lab's work?
This is a great question. Extreme heat is something that everyone is experiencing, especially as we are increasingly facing the consequences of climate change. However, the dangerous effects of extreme heat are typically invisible and disproportionately impact certain communities more than others, which is why understanding thermal inequality is so important now. It is easy to order a package on Amazon, eat a meal from a food truck, get your dry cleaning done, buy produce from a grocery store, or have schools and apartments without AC. But I urge listeners to think about how heat is really impacting themselves, the people around them, and maybe even the people that they aren't interacting with. I also encourage listeners to think about heat as both a current issue, yet a largely historic one.
Our next guest is the inaugural host of the Hot Takes podcast with Professor Venkat and is a former competitive gymnast. Please welcome Natalie Gertzler. She's an undergraduate researcher majoring in human biology and society. As a dedicated student researcher and manager of the Heat Lab, Natalie is deeply involved in various projects, including education initiatives, the Hot Takes podcast, and social media. Natalie, can you share what it means to you to raise awareness about heat inequality through the lab's education team? And can you share a bit about the different outreach initiatives taking place?
Yeah, so I have been on the education team for 2.5, maybe even a little bit longer now, 2.5 years, which has been my entire UCLA undergraduate experience so far. So I have been on the education team since I came to UCLA, and I hold it quite near and dear to my heart. But I would say our biggest goal, or like what it means to me to raise this type of awareness, is being able to present these often complicated, often intimidating, often not very widely understood facts in a manner that is digestible to everyone. So a large portion of what the education team focuses on is going through K through 12 schools and delivering climate curriculum oriented lessons to students. We have done lessons for fourth graders, we have done lessons for seniors in high school, so across all of the ages. And our biggest thing is to not just, teach them about these generalized climate curriculum things, but also apply them to other things they might be learning in school already. So for example, we do a lot of lessons at the local high school, Venice High School, and we do it to a senior engineering class. So we try to cater our lessons maybe a little bit around their engineering or other work they might be doing, but still keeping it very applicable to heat. So I think what it really means to me is just tying ideas to what people already know instead of kind of info dumping all of these brand new facts to people in a way that might be intimidating or scary. In terms of outreach initiatives, I would say we are still working on climate curriculum. We are hopefully going to gain a couple of new partnerships with local schools, but in addition to that, we are working on this somewhat of a heat encyclopedia, heat ABC book, with a working title of H is for heat, but it is subject to change. That book is basically set to capture thermal vocabulary words A through Z and display and present them in a way that everyone can really relate to and understand. So it'll maybe be targeted for generally middle schoolers, but people of all ages can really enjoy it and read it. It'll have visuals and pictures, and maybe you'll learn something new. You'll be like, wow, I really didn't know that when these surfaces are super bright and reflecting back at me, that is high albedo, and A for albedo. So I think that is one of our biggest initiatives aside from curriculum, and I'm really excited to keep working on it and eventually publish it.
How has social media, the Lab's podcast, and a heat-themed playlist helped share that information and research in new and unique ways?
Our goal with the playlist was to basically tie together heat-related songs. So it could be heat in terms of like it's physically hot out, or maybe hot, in the way of describing someone or something. Just all the different ways that like heat and hot and anything like with regarding a high temperature, metaphorically or literally, have been mentioned, I guess, in pop culture. And it really was just a silly way for people to interact with music differently and just kind of being like, oh, we're the Heat Lab. And even in the Heat Lab, we joke that we're the hottest lab on campus, which is kind of a funny metaphor even. And in addition to that, with our social media and podcast, it is true. Social media really is the most modern news outlet. I don't really want to call it a news outlet, but, lots of people, especially in the young generation, me included, receive our news from these social media websites. I try to still have a diverse intake of news, but it's really easy to be on Instagram, read a headline and be like, wow, like that just happened, and then keep scrolling. So we really wanted to maybe kind of modernize ourselves in a way. A lot of young people are really enjoying podcasts recently, so we wanted to make sure that we can still communicate these heat-related and thermal-related issues in a way that people across all audiences can still ingest. So that was really my hope with the podcast and social media, just to make sure we are still reaching these audiences that aren't necessarily going outside and reading an academic paper or opening up a textbook or attending a lecture. So just making sure we can get this information across all grounds was very important.
Well, it's undeniable that the different unique approaches that you're taking are allowing you to be as engaging as possible. I mean, how often do you find a whole playlist focused on, heat? And I did want to ask you, did you contribute to the playlist song or track list at all?
I think so, yes. I definitely made a couple of suggestions.
What's the one that you're the most proud of?
That's a good question. It's been so long since I've taken a look at that playlist. I thought I was really smart by including 100 Degrees by Rich Brian. I think that's what that song is called, because I think a lot of us, we were just looking for songs with the words hot or heat within the title, but then I was thinking kind of in like this meta way of what other songs might be referencing heat, but not through using the words heat. So I think that was kind of like my wittiest song I added, but I'm not sure if that would be my favorite.
The wit's definitely there. I definitely appreciate it. I'd be terrified if he was talking about degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit, but
Oh yeah, that would be scary.
that'd be terrifying. But you talked a little bit about, just social media and podcasts lately
being a way where a lot of people are gravitating towards in terms of receiving news or just being in the know? Have those presented challenges at all for you? Or is it one of those things that you're constantly thinking about how to use these same platforms in continually engaging ways? What's been the thought process behind those things?
I think as someone who studies science but is equally intimidated by science and how complicated it can get, but is also growing up in a world where science is being so questioned. I feel like now more than ever, science is at the forefront of being questioned by the media, by people in power, by even just, friends and family around us. I think it's just important to keep confident in what you are presenting. It's important to remind yourself that these matters are important. And even though it seems so trivial, you're making just like a 4 or 5 slide Instagram post, just kind of talking about, I think we even had a post about thermal mannequins, which is something that haven't been super popular since even maybe World War II, just keeping people updated with the way science is heading, but also where science has come from. I think it really proves much more beneficial than what everyone makes it out to be. I feel like learning new things never really stops. There's no limit to learning new things. Just because you graduate school or you leave school or you're done with school or you don't even like school doesn't mean you're ever really going to stop learning. I think learning is inevitable, especially if you let yourself learn new things. So I think by just continuously pursuing all of these, what we call science communications projects, it's important. Now more than ever, it's super important, even though it seems really scary and I chronically feel like I don't know what I'm doing, but I just remind myself that it's important. And people need these things. People need these accessible and digestible ways of consuming information. Yeah, I really think that's my biggest goal with doing these science communication projects. I think it just really makes these important concepts accessible to people who wouldn't otherwise learn them.
And I think just as a consumer of all things from the Heat Lab, I think you're doing an excellent job. You and your team are definitely hitting that mark. But, and not to throw a pun on our podcast title, I do need you to tell me all you know about thermal mannequins. What is that?
So Dr. Venkat will get very angry at me if I give you any of this information wrong, but I will try my best anyways. Thermal mannequins, MANIKINS, not spelled like a normal clothing mannequin, were these plastic fake censored bodies used in the development of war clothing, like wartime clothing, such as uniforms or anything past that. They were made as a replacement for real human bodies to test the temperature limits of the clothing they were putting soldiers in. So originally, they would come out with a new suit or clothing or uniform or whatever you called them, and they would test them on people. But obviously, testing the heat limits of an individual has not only its ethical concerns, but physical concerns, and then who's going to volunteer to be tested on this or who is being volunteered to be tested on this. So the development of the thermal mannequin came out with this plastic body that had all of these different temperature sensors. The modern ones have a lot of temperature sensors, like they can test the temperature of anything, anywhere, to whatever degree. But it was to basically mimic the human experience of feeling this heat. And so then from there on out, the thermal mannequins is what these uniforms were tested on for heat strain.
Interesting and equally terrifying to consider that.
They're horrifying to look at. If you look one up, they look kind of like a spider human. They're very scary.
All things considered, I think Professor Venkat would be very proud of your explanation because I can't get that vision out of my head now. What's the biggest takeaway for our listeners when it comes to the Heat Lab's work?
I think we are living in a world where people are often burnt out in conversations surrounding climate issues. It's something they've heard over and over again. It often feels helpless. But I think my biggest takeaway I would want listeners to hear is that it is okay to care, and more importantly, you should care about these issues. It's important to understand these things, and it's important to really start doing your part in these things. So I really would say I think my biggest takeaway is that it is okay to care about these issues, and that if more people began to start paying attention to these issues, we can slowly start working towards a better solution.
And our final guest is a cooking aficionada, which means she's no stranger to the heat, and she's set to graduate this spring. Nicole Flume is a double major in history and biology, and she's also an undergraduate researcher with the UCLA Heat Lab and is involved in research projects surrounding car solar heat, pharma heat, and is part of the Heat Toolbox project. Nicole, welcome.
Hi, it's nice to be here today.
I appreciate you meeting with me. So, Nicole,
How has being a biology and history double major and the lab's interdisciplinary approach to research empowered you in your projects?
Yeah, so kind of my goal when I came to college was really to get an interdisciplinary education. So I really came in knowing that I wanted to do both a social science and a life science. And kind of a big part of that journey is kind of being able to get a huge or attempt to paint a really accurate picture of the world around us with the two disciplines. So with history, I'm able to contextualize the world and see exactly what systems lead to how we perceive our reality, how we experience it. And with stuff in STEM, I'm able to really delve deep into, okay, I see for example, with the heat lab, I get really hot on a certain day and I start sweating. So why am I sweating? What's causing me to sweat? What is that kind of situation? And for example, one of my teams, Pharma Heat team, we look into the impacts of varying exposures to heat on the side effects of medications with known thermoregulatory effects within elderly populations specifically. So in this case, from the biological and biochemical standpoint, I have a good understanding of drug metabolism, thermoregulation, and how those drugs might affect that thermoregulation. But from a historical standpoint, I'm able to understand the societal structures in place that create an environment where people are disproportionately affected by heat. So factors like redlining and systems of racial oppression that decrease the amount of green cooling space, as a legacy of Jim Crow, or the socioeconomic factors that prevent people from having a cooling system where they live because AC is super expensive and it increases your rent. So those are all things that I was able to synthesize together to realize okay, there's these biological factors that are affected by people's historical relationships with the world around them. And that has been able to kind of empower me to take on projects like pharma and also other things that are more biochemistry based. I'm looking right now into heat shock proteins, which are very conserved across the genome. And there's really cool to look at how there's differences in that also based on your individual experiences with heat.
What's the biggest takeaway for our listeners when it comes to the Heat Lab's work?
Yeah, so I really think that the work of the Heat Lab really highlights the importance of interdisciplinary work, combining both those social sciences and hard sciences we've been talking about. By taking something that is literally all around us and analyzing the way it affects us both socially and biologically, we bring people from all different backgrounds into the conversation.
As we begin to wrap up, I'd like to loop in Professor Venkat one more time for some final thoughts. Professor Venkat, what inspires you most about working with your students?
So my students they're amazing. They're brilliant, they're hardworking, they're passionate, and they understand the stakes. Because these stakes, again, these stakes are so close to them. They're so close to home. And I learn from them every day. One of the things that happens when you become a professor or a faculty member is that your work becomes narrower and narrower, right? You become an expert in an area and you kind of dig deep, and that can be weirdly isolating, right? Because you're kind of in an echo chamber in your head, and you're thinking through these ideas, trying to work through them, and it'd be hard to kind of have those ideas aired out and to have a space to actually think through them. And what my students provide me is this kind of amazing space for collaborative thinking, to be able to try out new ideas. So many of our projects have emerged out of ideas that students have had, so everything from our work with the food trucks to projects we've done on kind of labor standards in California have come out of things that students have said during our lab meetings, or ideas or experiences they've brought to the table. And that just wouldn't have happened without them there. So my students are inspiring and they're brilliant, and this just wouldn't be possible without them.
Professor Venkat, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for the second episode of Tell Us What You Know, which was produced by Trevor Ducote for the UCLA College, the academic heart of UCLA. We'd like to thank Professor Venkat, Sophia Sabra,
Natalie Gertzler,
Nicole Flume, and all the student researchers from the UCLA Heat Lab. Check out their podcast, Hot Takes, on Apple and Spotify podcast and on the Heat Lab's website. And don't forget to follow them on Instagram at UCLA Heat Lab. Special shout out to Roger Martinez for the original music in our podcast. I'm your host, Alvaro Castillo, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.